Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Questions of Life. Today's question will be overlaid with some Sekiro gameplay. The game came out a week ago. I'm enjoying it a lot. I love the parry system because it's not like an instant parry, and it is making me be a little more patient. Bloodborne has kind of spoiled me a little bit with its instant visceral attacks and instant parries, but this game is making me go, okay, you got one good guard off. Alright, now get like 50 others. Game's really teaching me to get good. Anyways, this week's question is, what defines happiness? What is happiness, essentially? To be perfectly clear, this is not asking what makes you happy. Simply giving a list of things that makes you happy would grossly underestimate the scope of this question. In order to elucidate my point, I would like to give a few different responses from around the world, the first of which will be from ancient Greece. Now, the Greeks actually didn't have a word for happiness. The closest that they got was eudaimonia, which means to flourish. For Plato and Socrates, a flourishing life, a life worth living, was one that took a critical eye inward. For Aristotle, a flourishing life was one that lived on the mean between extremes. Now, let us turn an eye towards religion. According to Buddhism, happiness can be obtained by ridding oneself of worldly desires and possessions. All these worldly things are ephemeral, even the pleasure obtained from things like sex, food, etc. That's all fleeting. Accepting this and loosening the world's shackles on our spirit will guide us to happiness. According to the Judeo-Christian religions, happiness comes only through the grace of God. One must live their life piously, believing that Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior, or one must be subservient to God's will and accept that Allah is the one true Allah, or one must obey the covenant between man and God to achieve happiness. However, society also offers a different perspective of happiness. The American dream that emerged in the wake of the economic boom after World War II claimed happiness was working hard and earning lots of money, which back then would have been easy because the economy was fantastic. Now, not so much. 10 to 20 years ago, the general formula to achieve happiness was to go to college, get a well-paying job, marry, have kids, retire, then die, and that would make you happy. Now, both of these are drastically different from the definition that Buddhism gives. The point here is that there are plenty of definitions. The goal of this week's question of life is to allow everyone watching, a Warboy and Uchiha included, to do some critical thinking about what defines happiness, whether that be from personal research, deep introspective, or the teachings of faith or society. To reiterate, I'm not looking for an answer like blank is what makes me happy, rather a general response such as happiness is ... Thus, without further ado, I believe that happiness is triumph over challenge and strife. First, I'm going to explain what I mean by that, and next I will explain why I believe that. First and foremost, to explain my statement, I also need to make this kind of distinction that happiness has two types of criteria. One is pleasure, the other one is, well, not pleasure. For example, sex is pleasurable, and people who have sex, a lot of it at least, seem happier, more or less. However, the other kind of happiness, the other criteria, is this non-pleasure one, which would be things like having friends, having friendship, camaraderie. One cannot say that these things provide the same pleasure as sex, eating, or watching TV. They offer something else entirely. And these two criteria kind of form and generate happiness. Pleasure and non-pleasure, that is. Next, triumph is the medium through which one obtains happiness. Triumph alone offers pleasure. I mean, that's just how it is. I mean, example, simply passing a test or beating a game offers a kind of pleasure once it's finished. However, triumph alone is not enough. Obtaining victory without risk is just shameless showboating or circle jerking. It feels good, but it's not worth that second part of happiness. It doesn't fulfill that second criterion. In order for triumph to yield that second criterion, one needs to risk failure or risk something that they don't want happening. This arises from hardship and strife. For instance, once I beat Bloodborne at minimal health and stamina, I felt like I understood the game and its bosses, and even myself better. The risk here was, at any point I could just give up, and the only one I would be disappointing is, well, myself and maybe other people who I've told, oh, I'm gonna do this, and when I don't do it, they're like, oh, you pathetic whelp, you. But after going through the game, having understood the game, its bosses, and myself, I learned a little bit about my own playstyle. I started being able to play Sekiro a little bit better, and in learning about my playstyle and Sekiro, I learned that I also needed to be a little more patient in conversation. Through this introspection via the video game, I was able to see myself become a better person. This knowledge would be worthy of satisfying that second criterion of happiness. In summary, the two sides of happiness are pleasure and non-pleasure, and I don't mean anything that is not pleasure. I just mean this kind of blanket statement, the second criterion, these things that we generally understand grants someone happiness, from the common sense, from the general populace perspective. Triumph then offers pleasure, and risk of failure offers that second criterion. It fulfills that second criterion. The risk of failure arises from strife, thus happiness is triumph over strife and hardship. Now that I have explained my definition, I'll explain why I believe it. And my belief stems almost completely from William James's essay, What Makes a Life Significant, in part from Buddhism and Plato's philosophy as well. Both Platonism and Buddhism have this idea that true happiness can only be obtained in a world divorced completely from the world of senses. According to Platonism, true knowledge can only be obtained by knowing a form of a thing in itself. And this applies with happiness, because in order to know happiness, in order to be able to achieve it, one needs to know the form of happiness, which is not found here in this world, but rather in the Platonic world of the forms. Now, in Buddhism, nirvana, a state of enlightenment, can be obtained but after accepting the truth that nothing truly exists. In both cases, however, they say that happiness is not something that can be achieved in this world. While I believe things like friendship, knowledge, wisdom are good things, they alone are not enough to make a person happy. They only satisfy that second criterion of happiness. This is where William James bridges the gap between the two halves. So I give you an excerpt from What Makes a Life Significant. The element of precipitousness, so to call it, of strength and strenuousness, intensity and danger, the everlasting battle of the powers of light with those of darkness, with heroism reduced to its bare chance, yet ever and anon snatching victory from the jaws of death. But in the unspeakable utopia there was no potentiality of death in sight anywhere. The ideal was so completely victorious already that no sign of any previous battle remained. Passage illuminates the heart of the human spirit and the worth an onlooker would give to a life of triumph and hardship over that of a life in a utopia. James states that a utopia is wholly mediocre, where any man can get what he wants without needing to work for it. He claims us humans would actually find utopia boring because there is no sign of strife or hardship. To see what he means, perform just a simple thought experiment, if you would. Imagine you're in a world in which you don't have to cook. Food is delivered on demand. You don't have to wait for the next episode of a show to air. You can find it online in its original language and then watch the rest of it by pirating it. You could hook up with anyone with a simple swipe to the right. Also, you could do all of this without getting off of the couch. That would be pretty damn boring. For a time in my life, I was doing just the above, minus the Tinder thing, because who'd fuck me, right? I ate fast food almost constantly, watched TV, and even stopped playing games, because they just took too much goddamn effort. I knew something had to change. Deep down, I always knew something had to change. Sorekara nihongo o watachi ni oishimashita. I purposely took on challenges because I was bored. It has been 4 years since I've read What Makes a Life Significant, but its message has pervaded my life long before I read it. This message is the reason why I believe that happiness is triumph through struggle. Remember, try fast, take chances.